This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse, murder, and their families. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 199, Baby Lawrence Noxon. Lawrence Swift Noxon was born in March 1943. At 5 months old, he was diagnosed with what we now call Down syndrome. 3 weeks later, on September 22, 1943, Baby Lawrence died from electrocution under highly suspicious circumstances. His father, John Franklin Noxon Jr., was soon charged with murdering his infant son in what many considered a mercy killing. For this episode, I spoke with author Jim Overmyer, who wrote The Electrocution of Baby Lawrence, the definitive story of Lawrence's murder and the long, complicated legal proceedings that followed. This is the story of a baby boy who deserved to live a lot longer than he did, and a father who some at the time said wasn't punished harshly enough for his son's murder, while others believed that what John did was for the best. This is the tragic story of baby Lawrence Noxon. I'll jump right in. Here's my conversation with author and former court reporter Jim Overmyer.
I'm Jim Overmyer, an author of a few books, the others on sports history, and I have strayed back to my sort of roots as a courthouse reporter in Pittsfield, Massachusetts.
Okay, so that's how you ended up telling the story because it's local.
Yes, I covered the court in which this happened, not at the same time. This case goes back to 1943 and 44. I'm not that old. But there's a lot of downtime in court. It's not like Law and Order on TV, bang, bang, things happen. Sometimes you sit around waiting for something to happen, and the old-timers talk, and they would talk about the John Noxon case. First-degree murder, that was an amazing case. So I started to look into it, and I stopped, and I started, and I stopped, and I wrote 3 other books. I got married and raised a kid and moved from Massachusetts to Tucson, Arizona, and brought all that stuff with me. And I finally looked at it, the boxes sitting in my closet in my office, and they were always very accusing. I said, well, I have nothing else going right now. I'm going to write this book. So I did.
So it's been on your radar for some time.
Yeah, on my radar and on my conscience.
Right. I can totally understand that. Yeah. And I think it's pretty incredible how detailed you were able to tell a story that's 80 plus years old. And my listeners are used to very detailed stories, so that's why I think they'll really appreciate your book.
Well, I had some luck along the way. I was put in contact with the daughter of the judge in the case, who is a retired Boston Globe reporter. And she had her father's, of course, the case went up to the Massachusetts Supreme Court on appeal, and she had all of the copies of the court transcript that were given to the judge, and he kept them.
Wow.
And she had them in the closet, and she's too much of a journalist to chuck things out, but she wanted to give them away. So I took them.
Well, that's great. That really did work out well for you.
The district attorney, Charles Alberti, became a judge, and he had a son who became a lawyer and became a judge in his day, my day. And to do so, he had to close his law practice because he's now a full-time judge. He sold it to a friend of mine.
Okay.
Who was always interested in the Noxon case because I would talk about it. And Bill says he's starting to get comfortable in his new quarters. There's a whole building with all of this stuff. He comes and says, in the basement, we found a box with a bunch of papers from Charlie Alberti, the DA, about the Noxon case. I don't think I can give them to you, but you can copy anything you want. So
wow,
I did. I have the whole thing. So I've got notes and motions that they filed, it's boring sort of to read, except parts of them facts in them fit right into the story. So,
Yeah.
and Charles Alberti's son, Charles Jr., gave me an interview about family background and all of that. It's interesting family, the case notwithstanding.
Yeah, and that's pretty unusual, the amount of information you got. You don't usually get the DA's notes and the whole transcript from the judge and everything else. So that really worked out very well.
Worked out very well. Made it into a book, really.
It did, yes. Yeah, there's a lot of detail, a lot of backstory on the individuals in it. And so I was going to ask you what led you to tell Baby Lawrence's story, but now we definitely have a good idea of why and how it came about. But do you think you could give us the basic beats of the story? Since I don't want to give it all away in the episode, I wanted to kind of let you give us a little overview and then direct everybody towards the book.
Okay, it's a story with a lot of layers. I mean, it's a murder case, obviously. The personalities involved were very interesting, including John Noxon, who was an arrogant, extremely intelligent, very good lawyer, very arrogant, possibly an abusive person.
And that has to be one of the hardest type of people to prosecute, an excellent lawyer.
Yes, maybe too smart for his own good because, well, I managed to leave out the middle of the story here somehow.
Okay.
The book is called The Electrocution of Baby Lawrence, and Baby Lawrence was 6 months old. The Noxon's second son, he had a boy who was about 15, who at the time of this crime or accident or whatever it was away at prep school. Lawrence was 6 months old. I mean, physically a large, good-sized baby, but kind of unresponsive. And his pediatrician, George Hunt, had suspicions. And finally, at 6 months, he said, look, I think your son may have, well, we refer it as Down syndrome. Everyone then, that had not been an accepted diagnostic term then. They were all called mongoloids because children with Down syndrome have slanted eyes. So we'll call them mongoloids. Pretty unfair to Genghis Khan's ethnic group,
Yeah, I suppose.
but that's the way it was. And I mean, that was the common phrase, but that was also what the medical experts called it. And anyway, so George Hunt thinks this. So they go to Boston to an expert at Boston City Hospital who keeps the boy overnight and for 2 days worth of tests. And he says, yes, your son is a mongoloid. And there's a state school, Belchertown State School, a pretty crappy one, frankly. You can imagine in 1943.
Oh, I looked into the whole Willowbrook situation in the 70s. And yeah, I can imagine it was much worse back then.
Yes. Well, it finally was shut down in the 70s. The state couldn't stand the fallout anymore.
That's probably good for everyone.
But I can direct you to basically what amounts to a halfway house or foster care. Some people will take your boy in, or you can take care of him at home. So the Noxon said, well, we got to think about it. John is crippled himself, by the way, from polio. And 3 weeks later, he's down on his knees and he's got a lot of tools and things scattered around. He's fixing the radio. And this is 1943. And a radio is about half the size of your refrigerator. It's a piece of furniture, basically. And it takes a little work to get to the tubes and everything. And
I bet.
he's got a light on the end of a cord, and he's got tools, and he decides he needs another screwdriver and pliers. So he goes to he's taking care of Lawrence. Lawrence is lying on a metal tray on the floor so he doesn't soil the rug.
Gotcha. Right.
This is John's story, and he goes to the garage to get his tools. He comes back, and Lawrence has got himself entangled in the cord to this light, which is called a trouble light. And it's a bulb on a cage. It's usually used for automobile repairs and stuff. I remember my dad had one. And the extension cord has got some worn spots in it. Lawrence is tangled in that, and he's tangled in the ground wire, aerial wire from the radio in his other arm, and he's been electrocuted.
And it's just very convenient, it all seems.
Mm-hmm. John calls George Hunt, the pediatrician, to come to the house. And Dr. Hunt comes and says, yes, he's dead. He calls the medical examiner, that's the Massachusetts equivalent of the coroner, although you're appointed by the governor and you have to be an MD. So Albert England, the medical examiner, comes, looks the situation over, examines the wire, hands the wire back to John and said, yes, definitely dead. We got to go. And they walk out the door, Hunt and England. England says, it's probably for the best. And here we have the first inkling. We have these two things. First, how John Noxon is able to push people around.
Mm-hmm.
Fellow member of the Pittsfield Country Club, all of that. He's able to manipulate people through force of personality to get his way and reputation. Also, look, the boy's a mongoloid. He didn't have much of a bright life ahead of him.
Not then, yeah.
And it's probably for the best, Dr. Hunt. So they go home. The funeral director is called. The boy's taken to the funeral home, prepared for burial. Dr. England, I don't know if he sat up all night, woke up in the middle of the night about this, but he's got a conscience anyway. He was actually an esteemed physician in the city. He goes back to the house the next morning and says, I'd like to look at that court again. Doc says, I just didn't want it around the house. I didn't want anybody else to be hurt from it. I didn't want my wife, Margaret, to see it anymore. So he burned it in our incinerator last night. England spins around, goes downtown, finds the police chief, John L. Sullivan, a sort of a pugnacious police chief, tells him the story. Sullivan gets his deputy chief and the head of the detective bureau in his car, and they zoom out to the Noxon house, which is in a beautiful lakeside setting. And by the way, it's one of the most expensive houses.
Oh, sure.
In Pittsfield, on the edge of town. And Sullivan is kind of solicitous. So I'm very sorry this happened. And he asks questions, and Noxon answers them. And John said, well, the worst I can say is you were very careless, John. Noxon says, you're right, I was. It's a terrible thing. So then they drive down to the funeral home where the child has been embalmed already. I mean, this is almost ready to get away from the police because they weren't called in the first place by Dr. England or anybody else. And you look at the body, and on the left forearm, there's this burn. And I have a photo. I have a copy of the photo the police photographer took about it. The burn is about 2 inches wide, 2 inches square, which doesn't sound so big until you transpose that onto the forearm of a little child. So it takes up almost the whole inside of the forearm. And the skin is, well, the state pathologist later testified at the trial, the burning was about 1/8 of an inch deep, which is pretty deep.
Yeah.
When you think about skin covering. And he said it looked cooked. So this is the game changer for John L. Sullivan. Back they go when he's no longer hand-holding or patting on the back or anything. He's enraged. He thinks he's got a murder case, and he's all over Noxon. Question about this, question about that. And they argue, and he leaves.
I'll pause here for a quick word from my sponsors.
Friday morning, the district attorney, Alberti, the Berkshire County was part of a 2-county DA district at that time, and Alberti is trying a case in the other county, so he's not available. One of his deputy district attorneys has the Noxons in, John and Margaret, and they go through the whole thing again, and Sullivan asks some more pointed questions, which John pretty much deflects, and they leave. And over the weekend, the authorities mull over what to do, and Monday morning, they arrest Noxon at his law office, charge him with murder, and the case is on. Noxon hires, his first lawyer is Walter Donovan, who's one of the leading lawyers in the county, but then they hire Joseph Ely, an out-of-town attorney, a former governor of the state and president or board member of various companies, as chief counsel. And Alberti is back in town, and the case is assigned. I have a feeling I couldn't really get to this. I have a feeling no local Western Massachusetts judge wanted to touch this case with a 10-foot pole. So Abraham Pinansky from Boston, a Superior Court Justice from Boston, is sent in to try the case. So now we have something that may never have occurred before or since. The judge, the district attorney, the leading defense counsel, and the defendant are all graduates of the Harvard Law School.
No wonder it was such a big deal.
It was a big deal, yeah. Prominent Harvard lawyer charged in mercy killing. This is almost immediately. The local paper, and I worked for them, the Berkshire Eagle, the news was covered very thoroughly, but man, do not go over the edge. Do not even get close to the edge in speculation or inflammatory phrasing. And the Eagle never called this a mercy killing. Well, everybody else did.
Yeah, which is, telling of the times, but
It was, yes, a mercy killing of this disabled boy with no future as normal people see a future. So the case starts, and halfway through it stops. In the middle of the state pathologist's gruesome testimony, and there is no other way to describe it because the guy had to tell what he saw at the autopsy.
Yeah.
The case stops. There's a mistrial. Here's one of the jurors who is a member of the city school board, a former scoutmaster, has 8 children, has a nervous breakdown and a collapse, and he can't go on because he was interviewed later. He said, I just couldn't stand it anymore. He can't get out of his bed. The jury's kept at a local hotel. He can't get out of bed, much less than do anything else. Well, at that time, Massachusetts had no alternate jurors. So, boom.
Yeah, there you go, mistrial.
So they start again, needless to say. The whole process from beginning to end, from indictment to verdict, took over 6 months with some breaks in the middle. But it's an intensely complicated trial because there are no witnesses except John Noxon, when we got his story. And the evidence, the wire, is now a couple of strings of burned up metal. But the prosecution did a brilliant thing, I think a brilliant thing. Hunt and England had examined the cord and had noticed what they'd seen, which was 2 little breaks in it, one about 1 inch wide and one about 1/2 inch wide. And they went to the manufacturer, General Electric, of course. Pittsfield was a GE town, the major employer in the whole city. The cord was made by GE, and the socket and plugs were made by a GE subsidiary in Rhode Island. So they went to the GE factory in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and had 50 feet of the wire made for them. Then they went to Rhode Island and had cut it up into 12-foot sections, which it's supposed to be. So they went and had the attachments on. So they had, their witnesses said, an exact duplicate of the cord, complete with the breaks. So they have that. And they have the medical testimony, and they had the chemist who's the head of the state police lab talk about how he found an excessive amount of copper in the burns. And they are coming to prove that Noxon exposed the child to a long time, several minutes, to this force, to the electricity through these breaks, and electrocuted him. The defense has got their own set of witnesses, including the deputy chief medical examiner of New York City, Milton Halpern, who is now a defense witness, on this case, who says, no, this couldn't have happened. He had a wet diaper, and there was a safety pin holding the diaper. This is 1943.
Mm-hmm.
And he put his arm down in contact. He was in contact with the wire, and he was in contact with the safety pin, and it made the electricity go through his body. And they had a burn specialist from Boston who had conducted a burn study for the Army during a war. And as he was doing it, there was the famous Coconut Grove nightclub fire in Boston that all of a sudden he had 300 burn cases on his hands at his hospital, and which gave him plenty of stuff to study. And he agrees with this too. So you've got these dueling medical, and I mean, this took days. It was very, very complex stuff. And at the end, now Alberti's son told me this happened one night during the trial. Father gets a call at dinner time. It's a woman who works at a Kresge's. We call it a five and dime store today, right downtown, across the street from Noxon's office, across the main business street, and says, "This might not be important, but John Noxon came into our store about 3 weeks before Lawrence died and bought an extension cord." Oh.
Interesting.
So the extension cord had not surfaced when the police searched the house in September of 1943. And Alberti, going through Noxon's lawyers, requested, so to speak, with a lot of legal force behind them, that they turn over the extension cord. And they did. And it had been altered at the end and attached to a soldering iron, one of these very hot irons you do to melt solder and fix metal things. And Noxon is testifies in his own behalf and is cross-examined and says, "Well, yeah, that's, we had the soldering iron. My son liked to tinker." Son became a scientist, by the way, John III. He liked to tinker, and I fixed things myself, like the radio. But the cord was too short, so I bought the extension cord and attached it. Well, the cord by itself, they bring back a foreman from the factory in Rhode Island that made this cord too, another GE cord. And he says, "Yes, we make these cords. How long are these cords usually?" 12 feet, 3 inches. Well, they measured the cord. The cord was missing insulation. It was just bare wires on the end, about 9 inches of bare wires. And they lay the cord on the floor and they measure it. It's 11 feet, 3 inches. "Mr. Foreman, how long is this cord supposed to be when it left the factory?" 12 feet, 2 inches. So the smoking gun, if you will, finally appears. Alberti's argument to the jury is, this was pressed into the flesh to make those burns. Where are the missing inches on the end? Well, who knows?
Yeah.
And the case goes to the jury. A lot of people considered it to be a toss-up. The jury's out about 5 hours, and they come in with a first-degree murder conviction.
I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah, well, they were jurors these days. The press can always get somebody to spill the beans.
Right.
These 12 guys, all men, by the way, no women were allowed. Not only were there no alternate jurors, women couldn't sit on juries either. Like the Dark Ages.
Right. Times have changed, thank goodness.
And that changed shortly after, as did the alternate jurors, thanks to the Noxon case.
Yeah.
But I think they saw those photos, and I said, look, those burns didn't happen from a short period of exposure while the father was out of the room and back.
Yeah, right. It had to look more intentional.
So that's the first part. He's sentenced to death. The electric chair is the only penalty at that time for first-degree murder.
I'm sure some people thought that must be poetic justice at the time.
Yeah. Oh, it's great. Judge Panaski reads the required sentence, and the sentence, the current should pass through your body until you die. The sentence is practically the same as the indictment that charged him with Lawrence's death in the first place.
That's an eye for an eye.
So he goes to prison, and the Supreme Court upholds the conviction, and he's not done. His lawyers are not done. Joe Ely is not done. Joe Ely is convinced he's innocent.
Mm-hmm.
He always says this. the very end of the case. So does Walter Donovan. So does Milton Halpern and the burn doctor. If you ask them years later, and Halpern wrote his memoirs and devoted a whole chapter to this case where he said Noxon had been railroaded by witch hunters. He was from New York City and apparently never left New York City, and Massachusetts was like the wilderness to him. It was a witch hunt.
Right.
So they get the sentence commuted from death to life, which was not that unusual. The death penalty was a political football for a long time in Massachusetts, but really there were only 3 executions after Noxon's trial. Governors were happy to commute sentences to life unless they were really bad. After that, juries could recommend life, and apparently they often did.
Time for another quick sponsor break.
So he's still serving a life sentence, but he's trying to get a pardon. He files a pardon. Well, there's been a change in the governor's office. The governor, Maurice Tobin, a Democrat who commuted the sentence, is now out, and Robert Bradford, a Republican, is now in. Now, there's this another undercut thing about social status and class. The blue blood runs completely through this case on the defendant's side. Noxon's family came to America from England in the 1680s. Joe Ely's family predecessor, Nathan Ely, was already there in Connecticut. He was a founding member of the city of Hartford.
Wow.
Well, Robert Bradford's got them. If you're going to play those cards, Robert Bradford's got them both beat. He is a direct descendant of William Bradford, the second governor of the Plymouth colony.
You're right. There are so many layers here.
and Bradford had been an assistant to Joe Ely when he was governor, and then they formed a law firm. And Bradford, although he was on leave from the law firm as a state official, his name was still on the law firm name. In fact, the pardon application was delivered via a letter, and the letterhead is Ely, Bradford, et cetera, and the other partners. There was some feeling that he should punt this thing to his lieutenant governor, who at least wasn't related to anybody. He was only a descendant of Calvin Coolidge. I mean,
Only.
But, yeah, some kind of distant cousin.
Well, practically a peasant.
Yeah. But Bradford hung on to the case, and he didn't move on it. And he's defeated. The gubernatorial term was only 2 years, and the state was pretty evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, and it was like a swinging door. So Bradford gets defeated, and on his way out in January of 1949, just before he leaves office, he comes public on this. He says, look, I'm a former district attorney myself. I've looked at this case. I cannot give a pardon, but I'll commute because I don't think he's innocent. I can't pardon him because I don't think he's innocent. But I'll tell you what I can do. I can commute this sentence more to 6 years to life. And the 6 years is very important because the parole rules then as now, as far as I can remember, if you're sentenced on a violent crime after 4 years of your minimum sentence, you may apply for parole, 2/3, which is 4 years in his case. So he applies for parole. And the chairman of the parole board, Matthew Bullock, one of the first African-American high-ranking state officials, is absolutely opposed to it. He was never going to change his mind. One other member had made it known that he's fine with this, and one guy sat on the fence and finally came over to the Noxon side, and Noxon is paroled in a 2-1 vote. He gets out in January of 49. Margaret has sold the house in Pittsfield, can't stand to live there anymore, understandably.
Mm-hmm.
Bought a little cottage on Long Island Sound in Stonington, Connecticut, and they moved there, and they live, as reasonable to say under the circumstances, happily ever after. In fact, pretty happily, because they were supposed to not travel. The rules of his parole, he was supposed to stay in Connecticut, except he could go to Westerly, Rhode Island, which is 5 miles away, where all the stores were and the doctors and everything. Stonington was very small at the time. But they travel. They go to Europe a couple times, ocean liner trips to Europe. They go to New York City. They go to Vermont.
So the rules just don't apply to him.
Yeah, nobody paid any attention to him. He's not going to commit any more crimes, He's a fairly elderly man, late middle age, on crutches. He's not going to hurt anybody. We're just not going to check him out. A woman contacted me after the book came out. Her parents were friends of the Noxons. They met them on a tour of national parks.
Just another little trip.
So he got around. And he died in 1972, having outlived almost all of the major parties in his case. The judge had died. The DA had died. Joe Ely had died.
And imagine that when he was supposed to have been put to death to begin with.
And he was supposed to be put to death. And this is an underlying thing, blue blood. He was protected to a certain extent. Not to trial, obviously. He got convicted. There's that. This Bradford says, I don't think he's innocent. But there's this underlying aroma of mercy killing wafting through the room,
Yeah.
But he suffered enough. And there's this big fight in the newspapers, letters to the editor and all of that. Suffered enough. How can you ever suffer enough for killing your child?
Especially if it was intentional one way or the other.
Yeah. And he's freed by the social, political, and ethnic. And I say ethnic because the high-level Anglo-Saxons protected him. Who did they protect him from? Charlie Alberti, the district attorney, came to the United States from Sicily when he was 12 years old with his family.
And there was some racism toward Italians back then, wasn't there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He ran for district attorney in 1942, and one of his opponents, campaigners, came to the main gates of the GE plant, the main gates where everybody went in. You went to work on your shift, and you came out through this gate. Politicking for the other guy, and now we're already at war. He says, do you want to vote for somebody who might not be a real American? Pittsfield's 125 miles from the ocean. It's not like we're going to have a naval attack. They're not going to bring a battleship up the Housatonic River. But the GE plant was, in fact, entirely devoted to war material production. So, sabotage, I suppose. And Alberti, in public, he says, how can you say that? That's a real insult. I came to this country when I was 12. I'm a real American. I served in the Navy in World War I. So he's an amazing guy. A very poor family. Father died. Mother raises these kids. Somebody should write a book about her. Two sons were lawyers, and one became a judge. And two of her daughters married guys, and they had families that produced more lawyers than state senators and judges. I mean, it was like, you get out there and make something of yourself, son, daughter.
Right.
Yeah, he talked his way into Williams College, a small, exclusive liberal arts school in the county. Then he graduated, went to Harvard Law, ran as an underdog for district attorney and won by less than 1%, won again by 3%. He's really building up a following.
Yeah, slowly but surely.
When he became a judge, Bradford made him a judge. He deserved the judgeship, but there's some thought. The Noxon case hadn't been decided as well. If I make him a judge, he has to shut up about this case. He can't say anything if I let Noxon out. That's some speculation. And I worked in politics in 2 states for a while in the government, and it's not a bad speculation. So there's all of this, and it buries and part of my problem for the longest time was Lawrence gets buried by all this.
Yep.
And he only had 6 months. His life was only 6 months, so you can't. Well, he had this accomplishment in that. Well, he didn't have any, really. He's just there.
Yeah.
He deserved to be there a lot longer. Having trouble. One of the things that took so long to write this book, I had trouble making anything more than an incredibly long courthouse story.
Right, right.
And my wife, Ellen, who is a retired psychiatric social worker, helped me. She says, look, this is about Lawrence, you know.
Yeah,
maybe, maybe you should do a little more research in Down syndrome. And I did. And mercy killing. And mercy killing, I mean, we have assisted suicide now for people in the know who decide to end their lives.
hmm
Mercy killing at that time was a hot issue. And one of the reasons it was a hot issue was people proposed that there wasn't such a bad idea for mental defectives.
right.
Now we have the idea because it saves the state a lot of money, you know, because we've got to put them up and take care of them all their lives. And some of them, not the Downs kids, but some of them live a long time. So there's that whole issue. Is a mercy killing a bad thing? Is it a good thing? There were three camps in this case. One was called the Charlie Alberti camp, I guess, where, hey, this was murder, man. This is murder. The guy deserves punishment. There was another camp, I guess you could say the Joe Ely camp, but he didn't do it. It was an accident. He showed you the wire. He told you how it happened. It was an accident. And then there was a camp in the middle, and it was a big camp, bigger than either of the other two, I think. Yeah, he killed a boy, but go back to what Albert England said, leaving the house, wasn't it for the best?
Yeah, it's incredible.
Well, it's hard these days to imagine that big camp, but it existed.
Now, time for one last sponsor break. It's amazing how much has changed, but how much has stayed the same, because what I've found throughout 6 years of researching these cases is that children who have some measure of special needs, whatever it is, are abused more frequently than neurotypical children. But at least the societal outlook has changed a little bit on the topic, but they're still underprivileged in many ways. Just looking into Willowbrook, for example, gave me a huge insight into that. It was very disturbing to think that even 40, 50 years ago, let alone 80, that people had these mindsets, but they did.
That's true. But you know, I think back where we lived in a town just south of Pittsfield where this case happened. Down the street was a family with a Down syndrome boy who was in, I guess, elementary school, and we were there. I don't keep track of him, but people, you know, I get some news for a while. He's graduated from high school. He was in special needs classes at the school, and he was the friendliest, cheeriest, nicest fellow. And now here in Tucson, Arizona, we shop at one particular grocery store most of the time. And one of the bag boys is a Downs man. He's not good at ages, let's say 18 or so. Certainly not a youngster. And he's, you know, he does things. He bags groceries. They send him, you know, occasionally something has to go back on the shelf or there's been a mix-up and they'll send him off on that little errand. And these two guys in 1943, nobody could see anything in their future but being shelled up in the Belchertown State School or sent off to a group home or something like that. It's just remarkable to think about how these two guys, I mean, these are my two guys I think about when I think about the Lawrence situation. They were educated, they got jobs, they're in society.
Yeah.
Where they should be.
Right, exactly. And there was never a thought with these two men, would it be better off if they didn't live, you know?
Yeah.
It's amazing how different that has gotten, and
Yeah.
thank goodness for that. Did you come across any photos of baby Lawrence living during your research? I'm just curious about that.
I did not.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, maybe they just don't exist.
They existed. They existed. They didn't make it through history. Well, one of the defense moves, John III, the son, he was brilliant. He actually became a physicist, and as I wrote, he was as famous in his own career as his father was infamous in his.
Right.
But he loved to tinker. He loved to tinker, and he took home movies of the family. The Lawrence pictures, they had them spliced together to show the jury. And they described it as Lawrence, sitting up and being happy, and Lawrence raising himself like he might do a little push-up or something. It's interesting. And the movie no longer exists. One other of my lucky breaks was a lot of the evidence for no good reason I can think of, except nobody had cleaned house recently. Some of the actual evidence still existed in the Superior Court. And I knew the clerk of courts. I knew everybody there. I'd worked there. And so they let me see it. And the wires, particularly the original burned up cord and the duplicate cord that the prosecution had made, that winds up being an illustration in the book. I hired a local photographer to come in and photo it all. But the whole movie wasn't there. But it's funny. It had two reviews, sort of, you could say. And one of them was by Dorothy Wayman, the Boston Globe reporter covering the case. And she, it turned out, became convinced partway through the trial that Noxon was innocent. And it didn't really, I don't think, covered her reporting except this. She gushes about how baby Lawrence is so bright and cheery and all of this. And a reporter for the other daily paper in the county, the North Adams Transcript, basically dismissed the movie, saying, pictures show Lawrence, he looked feeble, he squinted at the sun and could barely move. So I don't know, you want to talk about a 5-star and a 1-star reviewer, those were them.
Yeah.
There are no pictures of Lawrence existing that I know of. I was in contact with one member of the family to see if they would like to help. Unsurprisingly, they didn't.
Yeah.
So I have nothing for the Noxon side. And I think there's no, I think they adopted John's story and they're going to go on with their lives.
Right. That's it. It definitely has a lot to do with class and American royalty, quote unquote. And I was going to ask, but I know the answer already. If you think the same verdict or sentence or parole would have happened if John Jr. was poor or if Lawrence didn't have his disability.
No, I don't think so. I think the sentence would have been commuted from death to life. I mean, as I say, that was not unusual.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, no, I don't think he would have been commuted again. I think he would have served a life sentence. William Mullen, who was the political reporter for the Boston Herald and wrote about this case frequently as it went along, and pretty astute guy. I read a lot of his columns on other things. His feeling was that this was basically Noxon's last chance. If Bradford had not commuted his sentence so the parole board could let him out. The incoming governor was a Democrat, Paul Devers, and had a lot on his plate and probably would not going to look too favorably on this case. He probably would not have moved on it. And then, it would have tailed off into history.
Right. He would have died in prison and that's it.
I think the fact that Joseph Ely was his lawyer and Robert Bradford was connected with Joseph Ely has a lot to do with John Noxon becoming a free man. Has everything to do with it.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Do you think the justice system got it right in this case?
I think in terms of the jury verdict, Morton Halpern, the defense doctor, the New York City medical examiner, wrote memoirs after he retired. And writing about another case, he says, there are instances where there is so much medical and scientific evidence that the jury is overwhelmed and they seize upon some other things.
Mm-hmm.
This was the case, if there ever was one.
Yeah.
And they saw those photos.
Right. I can see why sometimes they leave those types of photos out, thinking that they will poison the jury, but sometimes it's completely necessary, like in this case, to understand exactly what happened.
That's right. And I think the jury saw the photos of the arms, particularly the 2-inch square burn, and they said, that little wire for 3 or 4 minutes, you've got to be kidding me.
Yeah, and the fact that he laid him down on a metal pan, I know they didn't have plastic and things the way we do now, but A blanket, not a metal tray. What are you trying to serve him up?
Well, the prosecution noted that there were fiberboard trays in the pantry closet too, but Noxon happened to grab the metal one.
Just such an odd choice. It is sad that the photos of him don't exist any longer, but I guess we'll have to imagine him. And he certainly deserved a lot longer than he got.
He deserved whatever the best care could give him.
Right, yeah.
And Dr. Smith in Boston said his parting words were, I can give you the names of families who will take him in.
There were resources even then.
I suspect they had to be reputable places, or at least Dr. Smith thought they were reputable places. The guy is one of the leading children's health experts in Boston. He's not going to toss you out to somebody, just somebody. So there was that option.
Yeah. And if they just didn't want him, then...
Well, the holidays were coming, and their thing was, well, Thanksgiving is coming, and Christmas is coming, and John the Third is coming home from Kent school, and we would like everybody together. Well, that's not implausible. A lot of things in the defense were not implausible. But there's those burns, and there's what I like to call the Kresge cord, with the 9 inches missing from the end, concealed from the police because they turned that place over when they first went out. They confiscated half the furniture in the book room, the library, where the thing has the radio, the rug, the chair, everything. The tools from the garage. And so that cord was hidden away somewhere. Thank God, that this woman calls the DA. It says, I don't know if this is important, but you should know that he bought that cord.
It's a tough case, but it's definitely worth reading the book. The detail is down to the most minute, and I appreciate that. If anyone does, I do. It was a great read, and I do think that my listeners will appreciate it like I do.
Somebody who reviewed the book online said, it's a slow reveal. Well, yes, it is, and it's meant to be. I was trying to think of a way to fool with the cover copy and stuff and all of that and keep the verdict a secret. And then I realized, the first thing they're going to see is the table of contents. Never mind.
Right.
Let's just get this done. Try not to be cute.
I'm glad that you finally got to the point where you had to write this all down. And I think the way you did it was very well done. So
thank you.
I'll definitely include the link to the book in the show notes and everything. And if anyone wants to read it, which I, again, recommend, they can find it that way. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm really glad that we got to connect, and thank you for telling me about Baby Lawrence. I had never heard of his story before, and it's stuck with me now.
It sticks with you. There's no question about it.
Again, huge thanks to Jim for taking the time to tell us about Baby Lawrence, who absolutely deserved better than what happened to him. Even though no pictures exist of Lawrence that we know of, he deserves to be remembered. Please check out Jim's book, The Electrocution of Baby Lawrence, a murder that shook a New England town. I'll include the link in today's show notes, and you might even find it in your local library. Shoutouts to my newest patrons. Thank you to Shannon S. from Silsbee, Texas, and Melissa T. from Bryson City, North Carolina. Another shout-out to my newest YouTube channel member, Lori L. And finally, thank you to my new Spreaker Supporters Club member, Lupe H. I know I say it all the time, but I can't stress this enough. I truly appreciate each and every one of you for helping me keep this show going. I couldn't do it without you. That's it for this episode. Join me in episode 200 for another child's story. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com. You can support the show by visiting patreon.com/stlcpod, where you can become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to exclusive gifts. You can also support the show at ko-fi.com/stlcpod. Follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Suffer the Little Children Pod and on TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Lane. Intro theme music is by Dream Note Music, and all music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. And remember, if you see something, say something.